Thank you all for joining the call today. Today we have with us on the call Kyle Marsh, who is our principal program manager in the architecture team. Today he's going to take us through a session on authentication in collaborative apps with Microsoft Teams and Identity. As always, this call is recorded. We keep a recording of all the calls. You can go to our YouTube channel, which is m365pnp/videos, where you'll have all the videos from the previous calls as well. You can follow us on Twitter at Microsoft 365 Dev and Azure AD, where you'll get updates about the upcoming calls. We have a lot of interesting calls lined up, and this is a monthly call. It is on the third Thursday of every month. The next call is happening on July 21st. With that being said, this call is recorded. Let's keep it peaceful. And over to you, Kyle.
Thanks. Okay, so let's jump into what's going on under the covers when we're looking at building authentication in these collaborative apps. I'm talking about Microsoft Teams primarily here, but actually with our conversation at Build, we actually are enabling this capability in much more than just Microsoft Teams now. So what I'm going to talk about will apply to the new Outlook, as well as things like Office.com and so on. So these collaborative apps are allowing our applications or you to create applications that plug into where the user already is. You don't need to have a context switch over to another app. So I can augment their Teams experience or other Outlook, etc. Now, what's the environment in which these collaborative apps run? Well, so the key part is that the user is already authenticated into one of these collaborative host application or hub application, if you will. So the user's already signed into Teams, they've already signed into Outlook or Office.com. So the application has already performed that initial authentication. So this could be a native user of Azure AD for that Teams. It could be a guest user from our B2B, business to business scenario where someone is a guest in that tenant. There's native federation now as well as they might now with our reach out with Teams into personal accounts. I might have signed into that Teams instance with a Microsoft personal account, a consumer account like Outlook.com or Skype.com or Xbox.com, something like that. So an application that's running inside of this environment, instead of going and asking the user directly and saying, go ahead and authenticate to some system, they can actually ask the Microsoft Teams or Outlook, etc., who is this user? Since could you get the authentication information for me so that I don't have to have the user go back to the original identity provider and attempt to do an authentication again? So the environment here is these collaborative apps are running inside of an application that already knows who the user is. So let's get that application to help tell us who that user is and not have them go through an additional authentication process. This is actually very similar to the old days when we would write a lot of, say, Windows applications that ran on premise. We would have Windows know who the user is because I signed into Windows with my corporate identity. And then my application could have just gone ahead and asked Windows who the user is. I didn't need the user to authenticate again. Well, these collaborative apps can do the same thing, whether they're running in any of these host processes or applications. In any of these, they can go ahead and ask that container who is the user and not have to do that work themselves. Let's start with the process here. So I've got, let's say, Microsoft Teams that's running. The first thing that Teams needs to do is they need to authenticate the user. So they go off to Azure Active Directory in order to make that authentication request. Now, what's key here is that it's the Teams web surface. So if Teams is running in the browser, it's the browser. If Teams is running as a native app, it's a web surface that the Teams native app provides, where the user's authentication is taking place. Now, the key component of achieving a great single sign-on experience across applications on a device is the ability to share a web surface. The whole point of whether an application and Azure AD can determine if the user is already authenticated relies on the fact that we're using the same web surface in order to make the request, right? There's state, cookies, etc., that are left as artifacts of the actual authentication. So let's say the user does need to do an authentication here. They're typing in their password. They're doing a password authentication, passwordless authentication maybe. But whatever they're doing, the state of that authentication lives in the web surface that Microsoft Teams is controlling here because it's inside of the Teams app or inside the browser where Teams is running. So the user does whatever gestures they need to do, and now Microsoft Teams knows who this user is. That happened because Azure Active Directory returned something referred to as an ID token back to Microsoft Teams that says, here is who the user is. So now let's take a look at your Teams app. It's going to use a different process in order to find out who this user is. So instead of going off and talking to Azure AD, what the app is going to use is the Teams SDK itself. So in this case, we're going to ask Teams about the user rather than going off and trying to ask Azure AD about the user themselves. So we call an API in the Teams SDK that's just called getAuthToken. Now, this is not OpenID Connect. It's not SAML. It's just an API call. The Teams SDK is there. I can run it when I'm running in one of these applications that support a collaborative app. I can make a call to say get auth token. Now, what happens under the covers there is that Teams is going to go back to Azure AD and specifically ask for a token so that Teams can access your application as a resource. So Teams is still the primary client here. It goes to Azure AD and says, I would like a token to access this Teams app as a resource. So the nice thing here is that this request for a token is happening on the same web surface that Teams controlled in the first case. So any state, is the user authenticated, all of that is already in that shared surface. In fact, it's not really sharing the surface in this case. Teams is just reusing the same surface it used before. So all of the artifacts from its initial authentication are still in the Teams surface, web surface. So this will be a very smooth authentication. It's unlikely the user will have to provide their username and password, for example. There may be a consent process here, but it's a very smooth authentication because of the original authentication going through that same web surface. So by calling the Teams SDK, my application avoids the issues of what happens if I have to provide a web surface that doesn't have all of the artifacts left over from a previous authentication. Now, as a result of this, there will be something called a JSON Web Token, or JOT, that Teams will have received from Azure AD, where the audience or target of that token is actually your application. Now, under the covers, it's a slightly different token than what Azure AD gave Teams to identify the user. In this case, it's technically what we refer to as an access token, because Teams has asked to access your application as a resource. So what this token tells your application is that Teams is allowed to call your application, that the user is also, with any conditional access policies having been checked and applied and approved, et cetera, that everything is fine with respect of the user being allowed to use your application at this particular point in time. So anytime we issue one of these JSON Web Tokens, even an access token in this case, Azure AD has the opportunity to evaluate conditional access policies and say whether or not this user and this application should be allowed to be able to access this Teams app, this collaborative app, or not based on conditional access policies. So we always have that opportunity. And what we have now is a JSON Web Token with all of the same claims in it that you would have received if your application had gone directly to Azure AD to authenticate the user. It's just wrapped up in a slightly different container in that it's an access token instead of an ID token. Now, what has to happen in order to be able to issue that access token that's issued to Microsoft Teams to be given to your resource is we need a very specific set of application registrations. I should mention before we talk about the registration, that JSON Web Token you're getting from Teams can't just be trusted, right? It's a JSON Web Token that's issued by Azure AD, but it's gone through a third party. You're the first party, Azure AD is the other party. It's gone through Microsoft Teams, and you can't trust a token if you don't get it directly from the issuer. So it's important that your application actually validates that this token is legitimate. So it's going to do things like check the signature of the token to make sure that it isn't tampered with, make sure that the issuer comes from Azure AD, make sure that the expiration time is correct. All of that has to happen before your application should accept this token as, now I know who the user is. So let's talk about the registration that we do need to do here. Well, the first thing is, it's a little bit odd, but if I have my application that's running in Teams or Outlook, etc., what I have to register is I have to say that my application is exposing an API. I don't actually have to implement an API. I don't have to go off and create a server and implement some APIs, but I do have to register through as an expose an API because I'm effectively registering this application to be a resource to Teams or Outlook itself. So we're going to expose an API in our application registration. Now, the first thing I have to do when I configure an application registration to be a resource or expose an API is I have to come up with this thing called an application ID URI. The application ID URI is really just the string we use to uniquely identify your application. So by default, whenever you first say, I want to expose an API in your application, Azure AD will suggest an application ID URI that would look something like API:// and then the application ID or client ID of your application, because we know that to be unique across all of Azure Active Directory. Because obviously the identifier for your API has to be unique. So, but that's really not good enough for the Teams SSO implementation. Teams does an additional set of checks. They can check the location where the request is coming from to their SDK so that they can then make sure that the right entity is really asking for to get this auth token. So Teams requires you to put the domain where the application is running from as part of your application ID URI. So here, for example, since I'm running from my kylemar.dev domain, I had to add that as a part of my application ID URI, just to identify that this which domain my application is running from, and that gives Teams the opportunity to do an additional check before they go ahead and get that token for your Teams app. So this is a requirement that is put in by Teams so that they can do that additional check. The next thing I'm going to do is expose that first scope. This is a delegated permission. What that means is that when Teams goes to ask for a token to your API, the user's identity will be embedded in that token. And you're not getting the identity from Teams, you're getting the user's identity from Azure AD, because it's in the token that's issued by Azure AD and has not been tampered with. We know that because you checked the signature earlier on. So the way that your application finds out who the user is with a delegated permission access token that Teams acquires for you in order to access your application as this resource. So we expose this access as user scope so that the Teams app can go ahead and call, and this is what they're going to use to say, I need a token to this particular API or this particular app. And the actual address or the actual ID of that scope is the full qualified name here. So it's API:, Teams auth SSO, etc., all the way through to the access as user value as well. That's one big long string that identifies the scope, the ability of that token that Teams is going to ask for and eventually pass to your application. There's one other thing we need in the application registration, and that is we're going to pre-consent if you will, to the Microsoft Teams app. So this means that since it's a pre-authorized client application or an authorized client application, you as the developer of the resource, in this case, the resource is your Teams app, as the developer of that resource, you're saying these applications do not need to be consented in order to get this token, right? So just to get the identity token, we pre-authorize that app. And what you see here are the application or client IDs of Microsoft Teams, which has two different implementations. One is a pure browser-based implementation. That's one of these IDs. And the other one is the native client implementation, and that's the other ID. So you're pre-authorizing these client applications to be able to work with your resource, which is your Teams app. Now, starting from build this year, we're actually expanding that list to additional applications that also might need that your application, your collaborative app might run in. So this is the expansion into Outlook and Office.com, et cetera. So these are additional client IDs that are also allowed to call and get access tokens to your client without necessarily always requiring consent. So once I have that registration done, then that's why Teams is able to get this token so that I can now identify the user. Now, if all I want to do is identify the user, I'm really done here. I now know who the user is, but I only know who the user is with respect to their Microsoft identity. So I know this user's identity based on their Azure ID identity. Maybe I know this user because they're a guest in some other tenant, or perhaps I know this user because they're running inside of Teams with one of their consumer accounts. So what I need to do is locate this user in my own system using the identifiers, they're effectively their Microsoft identity. Now, what you want to do there is you could use the subject claim. The subject claim is unique to your application. So the subject claim that you get in your token will not match up for this user to any other application. It's based on client ID. So that's one identity that you could use. More commonly, we find, especially for ISVs or multi-tenant apps, to use a combination of tenant ID and object ID as the unique identifier for this user. So what I need to do is now that I have this tenant ID and object ID for the user, I now know who this user is in Teams. The token will also have things like the user's display name. So if all I wanted there, I'd be able to just get that right out of the token. But if I have a store that I'm connecting to the user of my service or application, then I need to find that user based on these keys, rather the object ID tenant ID key, maybe the subject key, although it's likely to be the tenant ID and object ID. If I find that user, then I can say, great, my user is authenticated. Authentication is a state that your application respects. It says, okay, now that I went off and called and got an access token or an ID token from Azure AD, my application considers this user authenticated and can now go ahead and proceed. This information that you get from this Teams SSO in this token is the same information you would get if your application had gone directly to Azure AD using OpenID Connect. It's just in an access token instead of an ID token. So you can now consider this user fully authenticated into your application and simply go ahead and proceed. Now, if you don't find the user because you don't have their object ID, tenant ID associated to a user in your system, then you will need to go ahead and create effectively a linking between your current identity system and the Microsoft identity that the users are using inside of Teams and Outlook, et cetera. Now, we strongly suggest that you need to go through an actual authentication. I see lots of developers who say, well, I can just look at this email claim because I've used email, so if I use the same email claim, that should be enough. Our concern there is that email is not an immutable claim. Different users may have the same email across time. Depends how fast, for example, a company may recycle their emails. Sure, in some cases, I might look at a line of business app and their on-premise IT pros will insist that they never, ever, ever hard and fast rule of never reusing an email, then maybe I could use it. But in general, especially for ISVs, you have no idea if there's a good process here. What we need to do is make sure that we connect the system to a fully authenticated user in your current identity. So you'll have to go off and use the Teams Authentication API from the Teams SDK to provide a UI surface so that you can go ahead and do that authentication for your user since you were unable to identify them based on the tenant ID and object ID of your application. Now, once you've done that connection, of course, the user's there, they've gone ahead and signed into your system so that now you have an opportunity to link those two identity systems together, at least be able to cross-reference by providing that link through something like the tenant ID and object ID combination. Depending upon, and just a final warning, you shouldn't try to match on values. It could be spoofed or changed in any way. You really should be basing all of this off of something like tenant ID and object ID or possibly the subject claim. Now, I'm going to make the connection between my current identity system, whatever ID I currently use for the user, and that immutable ID I get from Azure Active Directory about the user, their tenant ID and object ID. But now I have to think about where are my users coming from? Because as an individual, I might have a number of different identities within the Microsoft identity system. So I could have a personal account, and I, as an individual, might also have a corporate account. So for example, I have kylemar@outlook.com. I also have kyle.marsh@microsoft.com because I work at Microsoft. But I'm also a guest in a number of other tenants that still use my kylemar@microsoft.com account. It could be either my corporate one there, or even I could be a guest and a tenant using my kylemar@outlook.com identity as well. So there's a number of different identities that I, as an individual, might have within the Microsoft system. Now, depending upon the nature of the resource that you're providing, that may mean that you need to deal with the fact that I may have many different Microsoft identities to which I all want to access the same resources from your application. Similarly, your application may have lots of different places where the user might be as well, right? So am I accessing this as a guest in a particular tenant? What of your resources am I trying to get to? So for example, on the left, I have worked with one company where I ended up with accounts in their directory with all three of these different scenarios where I set up a personal account with a personal email. I set up a corporate account because my company started licensing some of their software. And I also had previously set up another personal account, but had used my corporate email address. So I had three different accounts in their system, all of which needing to map to identities in Azure AD. And even there, I might have additional identities as well. I could be a guest in a tenant. I could be a native user in the tenant, etc. So you need to consider when you're doing this linking between the user's identity in Azure AD that I got from Teams or Office or Outlook, I need to say, well, I might have a many-to-many relationship. This user might have different Microsoft identities that they want to connect to my service or my application, all to the same identity in my application. Or I might have the same individual but have different accounts on my system that need linking as well. It depends where your users are coming from, what model you use to sell your software, etc. But I would probably just, at a generic level, consider that this is probably going to be a many-to-many relationship between their Microsoft identities and the service that you offer, again, depending upon how you license and so on. So just be prepared that this may be required a many-to-many relationship. Now, if all I need to know is who the user is, I'm just going to authenticate the user. Say I'm not going to call Microsoft Graph. I'm not going to call any other resources that are protected with Microsoft Entra, any other API. I'm really ready to stop here. I now know who the user is. I got a valid token from the user's identity provider. I'm good to go. But if I do need to make calls to additional resources, the token that I was given from that get auth call in the Teams SDK isn't any use to me at all. I can't do anything with that token. It's an access token to my application. So it doesn't allow me to access any other resources. So I'm going to have to go get a different token in order to call Microsoft Graph or SQL or any other service or resource that's protected with Azure AD. So in that case, there's two different ways I could acquire that token that I need in order to move on and call an API that's protected by Azure AD. Our preferred solution is that I'm going to do an on behalf of flow, an on behalf of grant. But for that, I do require a secure backend. In order to ask Azure AD to take the token that I got that allowed Teams to access my application and say, now I in turn would like to access a Microsoft Graph on behalf of the user, I can only do that with something called a confidential client. And in order for that to happen, it has to be from a secured backend. I can't do that from, say, just JavaScript on the page, because JavaScript on the page can't keep the secrets that's needed. So if I have a secure backend, that's clearly the best way to go. I'll make the call to the resource from that backend, and I can use the on behalf of flow. If I don't have a secure backend, then I'll have to go ahead and make a regular OAuth2 call from my client, from that JavaScript client, in order to get that additional token. Let's take a look at the on behalf of scenario first. So we've gone ahead and gotten our token from our getAuth call to Microsoft Teams. And now, because it's a confidential client, I can have client credentials. It could be a secret, which is very similar to a password, which we don't really recommend heartily. You have a sophisticated secrets management system, it's probably okay. But if all you do is have a secret that you pass around, we would prefer you use more of a certificate-based client credential, because certificates tend to be better managed than just random strings are. But in either case, my application on its secure backend will have a client credential that it will go ahead and use when it makes the call, this on behalf of call to Azure AD. The first thing my app is going to provide, this secure backend, is the JSON Web Token, the JOT token, that I got from that getAuth call to the Microsoft Teams SDK, because that identifies the application, in this case, your Teams app, and it also identifies who the user is for which this motion is taking place. So you're acting on behalf of a particular user. The identity of that user is embedded in this JSON Web Token, this access token you got for Microsoft Teams. So you provide that to Azure AD with the request of, for example, I would like to call Microsoft Graph now. And you need to make sure that that call to Microsoft Graph is bounded by what this individual user is allowed to do, right? So that user's identity is in that token. So I provide that token to Azure AD. I also provide the client credentials that shows that I am the entity to whom this token was issued. So one part of my client credential is that client or application ID. That's part of my credentials, and that application ID is inside of this JWT as well. So Azure AD knows that you are the entity to whom this token was issued. It can check permissions, or maybe it may have to turn your application down, not give you a token if permission hasn't been granted. You'll get an error in that case, and you'll have to go back and ask for permission for whatever additional scope that it is you're asking. Conditional access can be checked, etc. But if all of those checks work out, there'll be an additional access token minted by Azure AD. In this case, your application is the client, so you would never look inside this access token, but inside the access token does identify your application. But now the audience of this token might be something like Microsoft Graph. So now on my secure backend, because I could keep a secret, I exchange the access token Teams acquired from Azure AD to access my application and thus identify the user to my application. I'm exchanging that token in a secure way to get a token where my backend now, or my application, can call Microsoft Graph, but this access token is still on behalf of the user who signed into Teams. So I don't need to worry when I call Microsoft Graph, this user is not going to be able to access some resource that they're not supposed to, because Microsoft Graph will make sure that any access will always be bounded by the identity of the user who's inside the token. So that's a great way to accomplish the ability for your application to call any Microsoft API, primarily Microsoft Graph here, but any API that's protected by Azure AD. It could be another Microsoft API. It could be an API within your application or your line of business or inside of your enterprise. But this is how I need to exchange the token Teams gives me, because that token really just identifies the user to my app. I have to exchange that to an access token to that additional resource. Now, if I don't have a secure backend, if I'm really just a single page web application, what I have to do there is I don't really use the client credentials. I just go ahead and make a regular standard OAuth 2 request to gain an access token to whatever the resource may be. So I will use Teams SDK has an authentication UI that I can use to drive this experience, but I can't be certain that all of the sort of most seamless SSO experience will happen here, because I don't know if exactly all of the state, all of the cookies, everything got set up between this new shared web surface. So I may find that, especially in the native applications, I have to go ahead and re-authenticate the user because I didn't rely on that authentication that Teams had done in the first place. So this will work. I can acquire this token, but I can't be certain that I'll get that seamless SSO experience because effectively I'm using a different web surface. And that's, again, really the key here. If I want to have a truly seamless single sign-on experience, it all revolves around the various apps and windows and collaborative app components all end up sharing that same web surface so that the user's signed-in state is shared. So anytime we have a situation like this where we have to go off and use not the same surface, it presents an opportunity where an additional authentication could come into play. And you'll see this most often inside of the native Teams experiences. When we're all running in the same browser, everything is shared by the browser. When we're not running in the browser, it has to be shared a different way, and that's where these opportunities to not get full sharing pop up. And that's why we strongly suggest using the secured backend method so that your user should never be prompted for additional credentials. There may be a consent prompt depending upon the state of whether the access you're requesting has been granted or not. But I should never have to re-prompt the user for their user ID and password or their password list, etc., because I know for certain that all of these requests have either gone through the same web surface that Teams used. Teams signed in the user on their web surface. They asked for my token, the token to call my application on that same surface. And then when I do my on behalf of request, it doesn't require a web surface at all. It works off those client credentials. So I'm quite confident I don't have to have the user go through authentication again. If I can't do that, there's always a risk that the user may have to authenticate. So that's why we strongly suggest building off of the Teams SDK and using that Teams SSO call, get auth token, so that my user will not have to do their credentials a second time. Well, before I open to questions, I did have one question. I don't know if anyone on the call has used or looked at any of our samples. Has anyone used or built a Teams app so far and used any of the samples that we have? For example, we have a Node sample that shows you how to make these calls. Love to hear back from you if anyone's used those. Go ahead and put something in the chat or raise your hand, or even if you have any other feedback, we'd love to hear any feedback if you've used any of our samples to do this so far. Outside of that, any questions or comments about this process? I know it sounds a little convoluted. We're certainly looking at ways we can make this more straightforward, a simpler implementation for you. That's certainly something we're looking at. It is a little bit convoluted in that you're exposing an API but never actually implementing one. But this is the mechanics of how our Teams SSO and the collaborative apps can move forward. I should mention that the Teams folks are also building tools. There's the Teams Toolkit. There's a Teams SDK. There's also a Teams Toolkit, which has got plugins that work with both Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. And they're great because they'll even do the application registration for you. Those slides I showed you about all those various application IDs you had to put in. Well, actually, the list I even showed you just simply came from the Teams Toolkit doing my application for me, application registration, so I didn't have to go through the mechanics there. So our Teams Toolkit, and now there's an additional tool, our Teams FX library, which will also help abstract away a lot of the details of your implementation. So we're working on lots of tooling today to make the process relatively straightforward for you to get your implementation. And then in the future, we'll look at how we could simplify the process. And then in the future, we'll look at how we could simplify the process. as well.
Kyle, looks like we have a question from Ivan. Ivan, go
Okay.
ahead.
Good morning. Hey, Kyle. At Ignite 2019, you gave a deck on Microsoft Identity Platform best practices for developers. And you had a slide on golden rules for tokens. And I've used this quite a bit since then with customers. But two of the golden rules were identity tokens. ID tokens are used for identification authentication, access tokens for authorization. And it looks like right now, based on what you just described, access token could maybe under certain circumstances be also used for authentication. And I was wondering, does that mean that maybe some of those golden rules are slightly tilting or changing, or maybe other components change as well?
Not really. So there is the rule that an ID token should only be used for identification. My biggest issue there is simply folks start trying to use ID tokens for something else, right? So, using it instead of an access token. The second part of that, tokens should only be used for what they're intended, is that access token. Now, it's a little bit of a skirt of the law here, but the token is being used exactly for its intended purpose, which is allowing teams to access your app, right? So I could, for example, provide a conditional access policy that, for whatever reason, didn't allow the user to access your Teams app from inside of Teams, or in fact, as we move forward, Outlook and so on, because I am effectively at the moment authorizing that access. So the resource in this case is your Teams application. So as a resource, it'll get an access token. So as a resource, so again, it's a little convoluted. So we do agree with that, and that's why we're looking to simplify this. But even though this feels a little different, I still feel it falls within the golden rules. In this case, your application is being registered as a resource to Teams, which it kind of is, right? It is something that Teams is making a call to in order to tell you who the user is. And the access in this case is simply, I'm going to go ahead and work there. But I agree that we're going to tighten this up as we look at how we can clean this up moving forward to make it a little clearer, so that we're not doing this. I'm getting an access token. My Teams application, yes, it allows me to do conditional access and treat my application as a resource. But in the end, my application was only trying to find out who the user was. So that probably would have been better served by an ID token. But I will admit, it's a fine splitting of the hair of that best practices, if you will.
Thank you.
I have a question really quick. I guess maybe it's a dumb question, but that app that you created, that Teams app, that is registered in Azure AD as an application as well, right?
Yes, it needs to be registered. It needs to be registered in order to work with Teams SSO. It has to be registered as an application that's exposing an API. Nothing is wrong with your application exposing an API and also being an app that would get an ID token as well. In this case, my app may never get ID tokens, because if I'm just running inside of Teams and I just want to authenticate the user, I'll get that through Teams SSO. So I'll get that access token only. But I would still need to register any APIs that I do intend to call from inside of that on behalf of Flow. Or if I went to get the token because I don't have a secure backend, then, so for example, if I don't have a secure backend, I have to register the proper authentication flow. In this case, it would probably be authorization code with Pixie, because you would be a single page JavaScript application asking for access tokens. That would get you an ID token there as well. But yes, your application is registered in Azure AD. There are just some specific requirements of how you need to do that registration to work with this Teams or Outlook, etc. SSO.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, if we do not have any questions, then thanks a lot, Kyle. It was a great session. We have recorded this call and this will be out on our YouTube channel. We will be sending out a note. One thing I want to point out, our dial-in info has changed. As you see, the old invites are not working. You will have to re-download the invite. Please go ahead and re-download the invite. I'll be putting the new invite in the chat. The next call is scheduled on July 21. We'll have more interesting calls lined up for you. Thanks a lot for joining this call. Looking forward to your feedback. We're sharing a survey. Please put in your feedback for the session and looking forward to the next call. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thanks, everybody.